What's going on, everybody? So today I have a really fun Grand Inquisitor list to go over. I have really enjoyed diving into Grand Inquisitor and all the synergies, especially after the recent tournament where we saw Grand Inquisitor placed reasonably high in some of the decks. And I think this is one of those decks where it requires a lot more thinking in terms of how to sequence your action, whether it's worth it to do your action, because there's a serious downside with it if you misplay with the leader action, which we'll have to talk about as we go through the entire deck. If you all are interested in more deck techs, more videos for Star Wars Unlimited, I'll be coming out with daily content as I have, so be sure to subscribe, guys. A lot of you have already subscribed, and a lot of you have engaged with all the content lately. It's been a ton of fun, and I've been absolutely loving it. But this has been my favorite deck as of late, and it has a really good game, especially against the aggro decks, because you can oftentimes just outpace them with how much damage you can pump out. As long as they're not reacting to your stuff, which they tend to not, you can really get out ahead of them. They also have a decent matchup against mid-range and control. We also have some sideboard cards, as well as just really powerful force synergies, which kind of leverages kind of the value of one of the biggest things about Grand Inquisitor is that he is a force unit, right? So we get to use all the powerful spells and such, which we'll get to in just a moment. I have a sideboard as well, but before we get to the sideboard, let's talk about everything else. Starting off with Grand Inquisitor himself here. Let me just swap myself over. So as I mentioned, the action ability is one of the coolest things about this deck and really makes it unique, as with most leaders, of course, but this one in particular allows us to basically make any of our early game plays immediately hasted or immediately be able to attack. The downside of dealing 2 damage to a friendly unit, as well as using action, which means we are probably not going to have the initiative in the early turns, is oftentimes mitigated by what units we chose to run. Simply put, something like the Scout-like Pursuer, which you can see on screen here, has grit, turning this into like a 3/2 on turn 1 that can immediately attack, which is really powerful. This action, as I mentioned, allows us to outpace aggro decks, getting in for multiple points of additional damage. And if they don't answer your threats immediately, well, they're going to really fall behind. The backside, on the other hand, is a lot less exciting with the Grand Inquisitor, okay? He's a 6 deploy leader, which is a little bit more expensive. And he is a 3/6, which is really on the weaker side. If this guy was like a 4/6 or maybe like a 3/7 or something like that, with just a little bit of additional stats, this guy would be so much better. And I'm not going to understate that. It is really important for your leaders to have decent stats, and the 3/6 is one of the biggest downside. His on attack or his action ability does level up a little bit because you only have to deal 1 damage to someone with 3 or less power to ready it, which does synergize a little bit better with certain units that we have, because we don't want to deal 2 damage. 1 damage is a little bit better. So that is something to consider. And most importantly about the backside of Grand Inquisitor is that he's a force unit, allowing you to attach certain things or get benefit out of certain force cards, which we otherwise would not be able to. Other than that, we also are running the security complex. Vigilance is our second color, mainly because a lot of the vigilance cards synergize super well with Grand Inquisitor's ability. But the security complex itself is one of the strongest things we can do for this deck specifically here. Giving a shield counter to units that have a ton of damage dealt to them because they were, readied up and have grit is really powerful. It makes it so that they have to actually trade with multiple creatures potentially, unless of course they have something like Sabine, which is really unfortunate. But the shield token actually comes in extremely well in this deck specifically. In a lot of other decks, I would much prefer something like ECL, for example, but I've tried green Grand Inquisitor and I actually much prefer the blue version. So security complex is actually a big reason for that. With that, let's talk about our ground units, which make up the majority of our list here. I will say the graphic here that I created actually is missing one of our 2-drops, which I'll start off with. We have 2 copies of Wolf. If you click on the link in the description down below with our deck link, you'll see it in there. But we actually have 2 copies of Wolf in the main deck. The main reason for Wolf, he is a 3/2 Saboteur with the ability to make it so that enemies can't heal. He's actually just a really solid way to shore up our game against some of the controlling, more mid-rangey decks. But most importantly is I wanted another 2-drop. We actually only have 9 2-drops without Wolf, so the extra 2 copies gives us 11. And as I said, we're a little bit more of an aggro mid-range deck, so we really want to have a 2-drop. Otherwise, we really are going to fall behind, or I guess a turn 1 play is what I should say. On to our first really strong turn 1 play, 2-drop here in Scout Bike Pursuer. As I mentioned earlier, has grit 1/4, very unassuming unit normally, but in this deck, it is a 2 mana, 2 resource, 3/2 that can immediately attack on turn 1. Really powerful. Nothing really else about it, just that it's a really well static creature that can attack immediately. Onto our second 2-drop, we have Admiral Ozzel. Once again, it's got the 3 toughness, which means that he can immediately ready up on turn 1 if you wish to do so. And, well, with his action ability, you could potentially even, well, play out a ready unit on the following turn, or maybe multiple units, depending on what you want to do on a later turn, with multiple actions from our Grand Inquisitor readying him up. Honestly, though, he is just a 2/3. It's occasionally good to use your action to ready him up if they play something like, let's say, a Viper Probe Droid, or basically any 3/2. I don't mind using my action on him, but you have to be careful about Admiral Ozzel with your action from your leader here, because if you use it and they play like a Battlefield Marine, or I guess that's a bad example because he's just going to lose to it anyways, but if they play like, let's say, a Sabine, or they play basically any 2/3 that exists, Seasoned Shore Trooper, or maybe their own Admiral Ozzel, they're just going to kill it because they're going to take initiative if you're readying it anyways, and it's not worth the 2 points of damage. Just keep that in mind. Onto our 3-drops here, we have Fifth Brother as our first one. This is the, I guess you could say, most exciting, or at least one of our most exciting cards in the deck, because it synergizes so well with our leader. Turn 3, you play Fifth Brother, ready him up. He is now a essentially 4/2 on attacks, but with his attack, you actually get the 1 damage to itself and 1 damage to another ground unit, so you can actually attack as a 5/1 immediately. Now, I will note, with the Fifth Brother, you want to make sure he gets in, because otherwise he doesn't actually get that 5 points of power, because he gets raid 1 for each damage. So if someone tries to trade into you, it's going to be way better for them. So again, sequence it right and make sure they get all their attacks out of the way, or try to make it your last play of the game or of the turn. And this is another character what's really good with shield counters. He's also a force unit, which works with our force cards, which we'll get to a little bit later on. Our second 3-drop here we have is Cell Block Guard, just 1 copy, a couple more on the sideboard, which we'll go over a little bit later. 3/3 with Sentinel, can become immediately readied up, but just a nice little Sentinel play. Again, I wanted another 3-drop for the deck, and I wanted to just play an additional copy, and Cell Block Guard is just a naturally powerful card. Another 3-drop here is Death Trooper. Not necessarily specifically good with our leader, but it is good with a lot of our other grit cards, right? Because this damage doesn't have to go on Death Trooper. It can go on something like, we'll get to Bays or Rugged Survivors, or even the Scout Bike Pursuer if we want to. Or we could just do it on the Death Trooper. If we don't do the Death Trooper, we can use our action to ready Death Trooper immediately. And in fact, if we play Admiral Ozzel and we want to keep initiative and follow it up with Death Trooper, for example, we can immediately apply the damage to Admiral Ozzel and then hit our enemy unit with that 2 damage. Just a naturally powerful card. Once again, 2 damage to an enemy unit is very powerful, and that's one of the reasons by running Death Trooper. Onto our 4-drop here, in Bays, one of our only 4-drops until we get to space units, which we have a lot more. He is, again, a very powerful card with our Grand Inquisitor. It is going to be a 4/3 with immediately readied up ability, which is really powerful. If you do have Sentinel or Initiative, he is going to have Sentinel, but to be honest, he's just a 4/3, which is just really good. That is immediately ready for our deck, which is, again, just super strong. If you apply the Death Trooper damage to him, he can be a 6/1, put a shield counter on him. Again, really powerful stuff here. Next up, we have Gideon Hask, just 1 copy. I wanted another 5-drop in the deck that I found to be really powerful, and Hask is just a really naturally powerful unit. It doesn't actually synergize with our leader, but if it gets defeated, it gets an experience token to someone else. Just a value play, really. Our other 5-drop here is Rugged Survivors, 2 copies of this guy. Kind of similar to Bays, immediately readied as a 5/3, but 1 extra power than base. And if you do happen to have Grand Inquisitor out on the battlefield, you get to draw a card, which is nice, but honestly, it's just a 5/3 that it can immediately attack, which is really, really nice. Our other 5-drop in one of our other strongest cards, makes sense that the Grand Inquisitor wants his other Inquisitors here, but Seventh Sister. A 3/6, so you can immediately ready her up again as a 3/4, but she has Saboteur and actually ends up being a little bit of a removal spell. This is one of our best cards against the aggro decks, because what you can do is you can ready her up, attack, and then you're just pinging off things like red 3s or a Sabine that you might not have been able to attack, or a Battlefield Marine, or whatever it is they decided to play, or maybe just hitting them with something random. You can even hit their own creatures, but you really oftentimes don't want to do that because it deals 3 damage to a ground unit anyways. And I'm sorry, I mentioned red 3. You actually cannot hit red 3 because you can only hit ground units, so you have to hit like Battlefield Marine or Sabine or something like that. On to our last couple of plays here. We have 1 copy of Count Dooku and 1 copy of Emperor Palpatine. These are kind of fitting in a similar or a relatively same spot in our deck here. We wanted a relatively solid later gameplay for when the games do go long, but you don't want them ruining your consistency of the deck. They don't really synergize specifically with Grand Inquisitor other than being force units themselves, but they're just really good value plays, right? 7-drop, Count Dooku, defeat something really strong. 8-drop, Emperor Palpatine, one of the strongest units you can play, just deals 6 damage divided as you choose, almost like an 8-drop 6/6 Overwhelm that has Overwhelming Barrage attached to it, which is really, really strong. So again, just some later game plays that end up being really, really valuable to the deck. But then we move on to our space units, and this is where we start to see a little bit of the curve start to fill in, right? A lot more 4-drops, a couple more 2-drops, and the Ruthless Raider, which is really powerful. Inferno 4 is our first one though, and well, it's just a nice little value play on turn 1. 2/3 can ready up immediately if you wish to do so. Again, 2 damage, 3 or less power, can attack immediately. And if it gets defeated, it's not the worst because you get to go ahead and get that trigger again. Helps you set up your next couple of draws. Just a really nice value play on turn 1 in any deck, really. Then we go on to our next space unit and actually skips the 3-drop into the 4-drop slot. And again, we're just playing a bunch of value creatures here. Imperial Interceptor is just a really, really strong, especially against the aggro decks. Again, you can pick off red 3s, you can pick off A-Wings, you can pick off X-Wings, you can pick off basically anything except for like Bright Hope, which is oftentimes what they play as well. But everything else gets picked off by Imperial Interceptor. It's also pretty good against the shielded units because it kind of just trades evenly for Bobas. And if they play like Cartel Spacer, again, you just kill that. Just a lot of things that it hits that does something useful. If you happen to have a flipped Grand Inquisitor, you can ready this up immediately, which is quite nice. Onto our other 4-drop, we have System Patrol Craft. This just gives a little bit of defensive viability against more aggressive space-positioned units. It can also ready up immediately, so that is quite nice. The 3 power on a flyer versus, like, let's say if you wanted to run a 4-power flyer or 4-power unit in general in this deck, is actually oftentimes worse because you can't ready it up immediately. So the System Patrol Craft fits the Sentinel role as a little bit more defensive creature while also being something that you can actually be on the offensive with, which is really nice. Lastly, we have the Ruthless Raider. Now, again, this doesn't have any specific synergy with our leader, but it's just a really powerful 6-drop fly unit. 2 damage to enemy base and 2 damage to any enemy unit is really strong. We get that essential Death Trooper, except instead of doing it to ourselves or a unit that we control, we do it to their base. And even if it's defeated, you also get that trigger. So this is oftentimes our For a Cause, right? In the Rebel decks, if you're trying to close out a game, For a Cause can be really handy. And Ruthless Raider does that and also acts as like that K2SO vibe, right? Because it's going to get that death trigger. And if they don't deal with it, it's just a 4-power flyer that's just getting in for a bunch of damage, which is really quite nice. And lastly, for the deck, we have the events and upgrades. And to be honest, this is my favorite part of the deck because you can run all, as I said, the 4 synergy cards. So starting off, we have 2 copies of Force Lightning. Now, there is a conversation of putting the 3rd copy in the deck, or maybe even in the sideboard. I've kind of, tinkered with that. Depends on your meta. Force Lightning is one of the only ways to cleanly deal with a K2SO. So if you go ahead and play Force Lightning, if you have a Force unit, of course, that's the key. You pay, let's say, 2 additional resources, so 3 total resources. You just kill a K2SO and it doesn't deal 3 damage to you. Really powerful in that matchup. Of course, it also works against any other, unit that has an on death trigger, or if you just want to pay 1 mana to go ahead, or 1 resource to go ahead and remove Sentinel or remove something like that. Really, really powerful. Next up, we have 2 copies of Force Throw. Makes you cause them to discard a card, and then you'll deal damage equal to that cost. Typically, this is going to hit a 2 or 3 costed card. Basically, every time I've played it, it hit a 2 or 3 costed card because people know that this is coming. But if you maybe catch them out in a later game, you can actually hit for 4 or 5 points of damage. Honestly, 1 resource to make them discard a card isn't the worst, but you really want to have a force unit because you really want to deal 2 or 3 damage, and it's a little bit of a hidden synergy. But I've even used Force Throw on my own grit unit before to get in lethal damage. So if you have, like, let's say a Baze or something like a Rugged Survivors, and you've already readied them up and they discard a 2 costed card, you hit your own creature, and then boom, you're hitting in for 2 additional points of damage. That could actually really matter. Then we have 3 copies of Force Choke. This is just a really powerful removal spell. It cannot hit vehicle units, but most units in this game are going to be those ground units that aren't vehicles. Kills things like Bosk, for example, or even, something like a Leader. You can just deal 5 damage, which is really, really powerful. Overall, the drawback of it, the fact that the controller gets to draw a card, is honestly not that not that big of a downside. Like, drawing an additional card, unless it's like a Han deck where they actually burn through their cards in their hand very quickly, or maybe some sort of ramping deck and you're in the late game, the drawback's just not really there. And of course, if you have a force unit, you could pay less, but you don't need a force unit for this one. This one's just a very, very good one. If you do have a force unit, though, you can oftentimes make multiple plays in a turn that are devastating, which are super sweet turns. Next up, we have 1 copy of It Binds All Things. Keep in mind that this one does not necessarily need to, heal up a specific unit that isn't or is a force unit. If you have a 5th brother, if you have something like a 7th sister, you don't need to heal them. It's just heal any unit, and then if you control a force unit, you deal that much damage to another unit. You can heal up, your certain grit cards like Rugged Survivors, like Baze, but you don't need to. This one can be hit or miss, so I only have 1 copy. You can just resource it early if it doesn't kind of line up. They just kill off your creatures or whatever is happening. Works quite well with Grand Inquisitor himself because he is probably going to take at least 3 damage because he's got that 6 toughness. But overall, this one's just a nice one as an additional removal spell. And lastly, we have 3 copies of Fallen Lightsaber. Now this one I've tested quite a bit, and I've landed on I really like it. And the reason for that is the +3/+3 that Fallen Lightsaber is going to give you is really powerful in a deck that you're dealing damage to your units to ready them, right? If you, let's say, go ahead and ready up a unit and they're like, oh, I can just kill that next turn, oftentimes playing a Fallen Lightsaber changes the equation a ton. If you go ahead and attach it to a force unit, which you don't always need to, keep that in mind. If you go turn 1 Scout Bike Pursuer, ready it, attack for 3, and they don't immediately kill your Scout Bike Pursuer, turn 2, you could just slap on a Fallen Lightsaber, and then suddenly it's a 6/5, which is kind of ridiculous. You can easily do that, and to be honest, that's really, really strong. The on-attack dealing 1 damage to each ground unit the defending player controls can be relevant sometimes, but to be honest, it's not huge most of the time. Just slap it on anything, and it is really, really good, specifically because we are dealing a little bit of extra damage to our units. On something like 5th Brother especially, it is particularly good because he can continuously kind of whittle away at his HP to get you a little bit more value out of that raid. So that is another one to watch out for, as well as 7th Sister, because you have that Saboteur, so you're always going to get hit in for that damage. Of course, if you put it on like Count Dooku or Emperor Palpatine, they are also very good with it as well. But can't attach it to a vehicle, so you can't attach it to space, just these units up here. That's going to wrap up the main deck, but we also have 10 cards for the sideboard. Let's pop on over to that. So starting us off on the sideboard, we have the last copy of Wolf. As I mentioned, we have 2 copies in the main deck, which wasn't shown on the graphic, but he comes in against those control matchups. We have 2 copies of Del Miko. This one's actually really, really powerful because it can be readied up and is actually really good in the aggro matchup as well as the more controlling matchups because you can restore immediately. So it actually races while also giving you a little bit more HP to back you up. We have 3 copies of Cargo Juggernaut. Now this one really just is for the heavy aggro decks. You don't have any synergies. It's just I play it, I gain 4, and oftentimes that's just good enough to finish off the game, to be honest. Cargo Juggernaut's such an insane swing, especially since it comes in on 6. And with Cargo Juggernaut coming in on 6, you probably have already been racing them the whole game. So turns 5 or so is right about when you really put the final nail in the coffin. If they haven't finished you off, or they're going to finish you off that turn, Cargo Juggernaut throws off the math. This is also the time when you can ready up Grand Inquisitor. So this is oftentimes the turn I found where if we're just kind of 2 ships passing in the night, we're just attacking each other's bases, ignoring each other, I play a Cargo Juggernaut that gives me just enough time to live through that turn and finish off all my attacks with my units so that I can win the game. Very powerful. Next up, we have 2 copies of Avenger. This comes in against the mid-rangey / more controlling decks again. Just gives you a little bit more value in the later portions of the game. And oftentimes things like, maybe a little bit more removal spells for the early game are a little bit less valuable and such. So Avenger comes in, but it really depends on the matchup. Of course, if they're more mid-rangey, then Avenger can be really powerful, just kind of knocking off all their later game units. And of course, they're more controlling, then this is just something to give us a little bit more game in the later stages of the game. And lastly, 2 copies of Takedown. Now, this one is specifically for Boba. I have found that you really want something to deal with 5 cost or 5 HP units, because what will happen is they will oftentimes like ECL out a Steadfast Battalion. They will go ahead and ECL out a Rook or something. Now Rook can't necessarily get hit by this unless you've dealt 1 damage to it, but heck, even their Boba Fett, or if they even have a couple points of damage on their leader, all of which can get killed by Takedown. But Takedown really, Steadfast Battalion and the 3 cost Boba Fett, those are the 2 targets for this. If you do not kill out Boba Fett, he can absolutely destroy your game, as per usual. But in this deck specifically, he's almost always going to kill something with that 3 damage. So keep that in mind, and you do not want to end up in a situation where Boba Fett's running rampant, because they will outrace you if that is the case. And to be honest, they oftentimes outrace you because Boba Fett's just so strong. So you got to have some takedowns in the deck for that reason. There is one other card that I wanted to mention about. That is the Force Lightning. As I said earlier, I actually have been kind of fiddling with another copy of Force Lightning. But to be honest, the aggro matchup is pretty good for this deck. The decks that I wanted to focus on are Boba and any sort of other mid-range control matchup. So we have the 3 copies for, aggro. That's the Cargo Juggernaut. And then Del Miko, as I said, can come in the aggro matchup, but also works really good against Boba, specifically because all their events cost 1 more. It's just super powerful against that kind of archetype. And so you're just getting a lot of value. So I don't really want to tune it more towards, anti-aggro, because again, we already have a decent matchup against this. So you don't really need to do too much to win that game, unless of course they just have a really good draw and you do not. But that's going to kind of wrap us up here. It was really fun playing with this deck. I definitely recommend giving it a try. It's a very different play style because you end up just taking a ridiculous amount of actions, because you get to take a ridiculous amount of actions because you get to ready up everything every turn, at least for the first couple of turns of the game. Turn 1, ready, attack, or play a unit, ready, attack. You've played, or at least done, 3 different things, and they've done 1 and took initiative, most likely. So just a fun little deck to play with. And I don't know about you all, but I like to get a little bit of vigilance in my life. I played a lot of aggression. I played a lot of command. Green is, of course, the most dominant color, I would say, but it's nice to play with vigilance cards because they are quite strong. And it's also nice to play them without having to be that more controlling, more mid-rangey shell. This is like an aggro vigilance, which is like a little bit different from what you might have seen otherwise. So thanks for watching, everyone. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one.